For decades, NASA has been the dominant force by far within the rocket industry. From building a rocket that could reach the moon to building a rocket that could be used dozens of times. Not all of their rockets have gone exactly to plan or achieved everything they set out to accomplish. But despite the ups and downs through NASA's history, NASA has always been the leader when it came to rocket innovation and development. About a decade ago though, NASA finally gave in to external pressures and started relying on the Russians to send astronauts to space. Originally, this was just supposed to be a temporary solution while NASA finished up their newest rocket, the Space Launch System. Over the last several years though, it seems more and more likely that this temporary break from in-house rockets may turn into a permanent break. So here's why SLS may very well be the last rocket NASA builds. Starting off, the largest challenge NASA has been facing since their inception is politics. NASA is a government organization, and their funding and projects are almost solely determined by public interest. This is one of the main reasons that NASA hasn't returned to the moon in nearly 50 years. After NASA completed a couple of crewed missions to the moon in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the general public was more or less satisfied with NASA's progress. The US had decisively beaten the Soviets to the moon, and that was basically the end of the story for the average American. Now, this doesn't mean that the average American thought that NASA should be shut down after reaching the moon or anything like that. But the overall excitement and eagerness surrounding NASA died off after the space race. And when the public isn't interested about a specific topic, neither are politicians. This led to NASA's budget being cut right after they reached the moon. In the late 1960s, NASA's budget rose to $5 billion per year, but by 1974, their budget was cut nearly in half, down to a little over $3 billion. Since then, NASA has never enjoyed the same level of public excitement, and this has been reflected in their budgets and the scope of their projects. What's even worse than politics having a stronghold on NASA, however, is the lack of knowledgeable leadership. You see, senators and presidents are not only motivated by votes, but they don't really know what they're doing when it comes to rockets. This isn't really their fault, as they're not engineers, they're lawyers and businessmen. The problem though is that they have the power to make engineering decisions for NASA. And it's not surprising that this leads to poor decisions being made for NASA. One of these poor decisions was reusing space shuttle parts on SLS. When SLS was approved, Congress demanded that NASA must reuse parts from the space shuttle wherever possible. The motivation for this decision was twofold. First of all, if NASA reused parts from the space shuttle, development should be cheaper as they don't have to create everything from scratch. Operations should also theoretically be cheaper, as NASA already has experience using these parts in the space shuttle. The second factor that motivated this decision was jobs. When the space shuttle program came to an end, thousands of engineers were displaced. So, Congress thought that it was a good idea to repurpose these engineers on SLS and protect as many jobs as possible. While this decision was made with good intentions, it makes the senator's lack of engineering knowledge or disregard for this knowledge extremely clear. Here's the thing, the space shuttle was designed and built in the 1970s. And since then, technology has come a long way. I mean, personal computers were just starting to be a thing when the space shuttle was designed. So it's quite stupid to try to repurpose this technology 40 years later. Imagine if Intel decided to repurpose chips from the 1970s, or Microsoft decided to repurpose MS-DOS just so they could protect jobs. It would have been a much better idea to let NASA design a brand new rocket using prior experience as opposed to directly using prior parts. But unfortunately, this is the type of decisions you get when you have Congress make engineering decisions. Ultimately, all of this culminates into NASA being an extremely inefficient space organization. There's no question that NASA is plagued with delays and cost overruns. SLS, for instance, was supposed to take flight in 2016, yet here we are in 2021. Considering all of these delays, the Office of Inspector General decided to get to the root of the problem by conducting an audit of NASA in 2012. The audit found that there were 4 key factors holding back NASA. The first 2 factors were NASA's culture of over-optimism and a consistent pattern of underestimating technical complexity. These 2 factors are basically applicable to every space agency though, so we'll ignore these. The last 2 factors, however, are much more unique to NASA, and this includes funding instability and poor project management. Funding instability can be explained by politics, and poor project management can be explained by senators making engineering decisions. Unfortunately, NASA has been battling these obstacles for decades. But NASA has found a solution, and this is of course the private space industry. By funding private space companies and letting them complete missions, NASA is able to largely avoid the limitations that come along with being a government-led organization. When awarding contracts to private space companies, Congress doesn't really have too much power over the specifics of the project or development process. Each contract is really just a general outline of what needs to be achieved, for what price it needs to be accomplished, and when it needs to be completed by. This essentially gives the engineering decision-making power back to the engineers at these private companies. For legacy companies like Boeing, giving back this power doesn't really make that big of a difference, as they themselves have been stalling for decades. With innovative companies like SpaceX though, having the power to make experimental decisions is substantial. One of the key attributes of Falcon 9 is the booster's ability to land vertically with extreme precision. During the development process, SpaceX failed several times while trying to land boosters, and it seemed like the idea was impossible. SpaceX did eventually prove the skeptics wrong, but NASA would have never gotten to that stage even if they had the required expertise and technology. Congress would have likely never approved such an ambitious project for NASA, and even if they did, they would have limited NASA to a small budget and a limited number of attempts. So, even if NASA was capable of developing vertically landing boosters, Congress would have prevented them from doing so. The same thing can be said about SpaceX's upcoming Starship rocket and their crazy plan with the belly flop maneuver. It's not just large ambitious projects that NASA wouldn't have control over though. Oftentimes, NASA isn't even able to make simple design or material changes. For example, SpaceX has been experimenting with stainless steel on Starship because they think stainless steel provides a variety of unique advantages. If NASA wanted to experiment with stainless steel, however, the process of switching would be quite difficult. As we all know, rockets are massive and consume a large amount of raw materials. Generally, rockets are built using carbon composites and aluminum, and this provides a decent amount of jobs for carbon and aluminum mining companies. If NASA wanted to switch to stainless steel, I'm almost certain that some representative would object because their county is dependent on carbon or aluminum mining. But by being a commercial customer of SpaceX, NASA can switch to stainless steel rockets without getting approval from Congress. And this path is looking more favorable than ever before given the rapid progress of the private space industry. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the key players within the private space industry were large aircraft manufacturers like Boeing and Lockheed Martin. These companies never really cared that much about space though. They were extremely successful within the aircraft industry, and that was their primary focus. Building modules and probes for NASA were just an easy side hustle to bring in some extra profit. It wasn't until the early 2000s that we saw the formation of companies whose sole purpose was space. At the time, it wasn't clear how successful these companies would be. But as these companies prove their viability, it simply makes more and more sense to rely on them. And that brings me on to my final point, which is that NASA has been stepping away from rocket development for decades. Relying on private companies is nothing new for NASA, as they've been contracting out large portions of their rockets and projects to private companies for quite some time. In 1993, for instance, NASA gave Boeing the responsibility of designing, developing, and constructing large portions of the ISS. Similarly, NASA gave Lockheed Martin the responsibility of building the Orion space capsule. Meanwhile, Boeing got the job of building most of SLS itself. And now, SpaceX is getting the responsibility of returning humans to the moon alongside NASA. As you can see, NASA realized their limitations very early on, and they resorted to outsourcing to bypass their limitations. Until now, they chose to oversee all of the activities of their subcontractors, and they kept ownership of the rocket itself. But with Falcon 9, and especially Starship, NASA's actions showcase that they believe that the private space industry has evolved to a level at which NASA can completely transfer the reins of rocket development to the private companies. This will allow NASA to better focus on what will be done using the rockets as opposed to just building the rockets. What will happen to SLS then? Well, I don't think NASA is going to retire SLS super early or anything like that. They've already poured way too many resources into it, and there's no way Congress is going to let NASA retire SLS without actually reaching the moon using SLS. So I'm pretty confident that SLS will be used throughout this decade to complete a handful of crewed missions to the moon. But once NASA reaches the moon using SLS, Congress will feel like their investment was worth it, and there will be much less pressure to use SLS. At that point, I think SLS will slowly fade from the light and be retired simply due to a lack of use in the late 2030s. And due to all the points laid out in this video, I think NASA will avoid developing a new rocket and simply rely on private companies. Does this mean that NASA will never build a new in-house rocket? Not necessarily. It's possible that they decide to build a new rocket 30 or 40 years from now for one reason or another. But SLS will likely be the last rocket that NASA builds for quite some time, if not ever. That is unless Congress forced them to build a new in-house rocket. What do you guys think about Congress's tight control over NASA? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you are happy to see NASA choosing to leverage the private space industry. And of course, consider joining our Discord community to suggest future video ideas, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.